Of course, I have to cough right before.
This might be handy as well.
Oh, we're live now. We are live. Birdie none, dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Better put my on mute because I know exactly what's going to happen. There you go. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Desert of the Real. This is Aeon Byte live, episode 15, unless I'm mistaken. And we're going to have a great show. We're going to talk about something overdue, something I feel will clear the air. And this will be the Sumerian origins or influence on Gnosticism, although obviously the Sumerians influenced everything. I mean, not just religion, you name it. They are behind everything and certainly behind the imagination and conspiracy of our modern times. So hopefully we can clear that up, although I doubt it because people gonna people. So with us, definitely an honor to have for the second time, Vanessa Kendall. How are you doing, Vanessa?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure is all ours, and thank you. And certainly great to have on Nate, the occult fan. Welcome back, Nate. Good to have you.
Hey, Miguel, and hey, Vance, and hey, Vanessa, and hey, everyone in the chat. Thanks so much for having me, Miguel.
Oh, pleasure's all ours, and you got the mic. I want to see a mic drop tonight, so you know, inspired to say something really intense and just
no pressure. Okay, good.
And of course, never last and never least, we've got Vance the Moondog. How are you, Vance?
Oh, I'm barely howling, but I'm howling.
All right. Well, I hope you got your Innana Gavida, or how does the iron butterfly sound? It's not Sumerian. It's, I believe it's going to say in the Garden of Eden, but I always think of Innana. But anyway, we are here. People are starting to roll into the chat room. For those who don't know, Vance and I will try to take your question. Please be patient, and we'll get to the questions for Vanessa or whoever you have. We do have a super chat, which will, if you donate, of course, you'll be put at the top. Your question will be questioned and will be answered, hopefully. And of course, it always helps the show because I need help. I need support. Everybody needs help. Everybody needs support. But thanks for being here. And your presence certainly supports Aeon Byte, Gnostic Radio. As always, this is live, but the audio version will be out in a couple of days on all the podcast channels and so. What was that?
Whoa.
I don't think it's on my end. Oh, well, maybe the Anunnaki have come to visit and interrupt us. So anyway, everybody looking good there in the chat. It is the Anunnaki. We just have to find who it is. It's not on my end. Okay.
It doesn't sound like on my end either, but who can tell?
All right. All right. Maybe again, it was just a passing archon or something like that. We'll keep an eye on that. Hopefully, it's not the Kevin Kylie waterfalls. Whoa, we lost Vanessa. Hopefully, she'll come back. Maybe it was on her end. Well, we'll just have to keep an eye out for that, and hopefully she'll be back. I'll look at my phone in case there's an issue. She is back. Was that on your end, Vanessa?
Yeah, I accidentally bumped my headset and I stopped hearing anything.
Those technology archons. Well, anyway, now that you have come back from the dead, you must have gone down to the underworld and come back.
Hello to Risk Call.
Yeah, exactly. So what I wanted to start is something interesting that we've been talking about, and we were talking about Saturn and Jupiter retrograde, and we were talking about it because I was feeling a very dark or strange turn in my life and my energies, inward and outward, like there was a resistance and things were a lot harder. It wasn't the usual Mercury retrograde and technology stops working and all that other stuff. But this was different. It's like I was swimming uphill, and you were the one who told me, oh, this is exactly when it happened to me. It's because we got Jupiter and Saturn retrograde. So maybe tell the audience, because there's going to be a lot of misinformation on that. What are these two astrological events, or what's their issues?
Well, to really understand them, first you got to understand what Jupiter and Saturn represent in terms of astrology, which is Jupiter is the planet that associates with anything that's to do with like executive function. So in your personal life, that tends to be the things that are like your ability to, like your motivation for things, your ability to focus on tasks without like getting lost or losing motivation or getting depressed or whatever. And then Saturn is the restrictor, the one who essentially is like the force of the demiurge, is the way that it's often explained, is the restriction, the restrictive laws of nature, all those sort of things. So when you have Saturn in retrograde, it's essentially forcing you to deal with things that you haven't dealt with. It's like fate coming forth, fate, like karma paying its due.
Bug.
And then Jupiter retrograde is basically your ability to, executively function in your own life is lost. And so when you mix those two together, you've got a recipe for a whole lot of like depression and like everything seeming like it's going to go wrong because all the negative karma is getting paid back in full. Though it can sometimes be positive, at least in the case of Saturn retrograde, because, that can also be like good karma getting paid back. So it's somewhat balanced out by that, but largely there's going to be a lot of things start hitting the wall, so to speak, or hitting the fan.
Yeah, because that's how I felt. It's like I've hit a wall and some things are coming to roost. And anyway, there's a huge resistance. What about you, Nate? Have you heard of this, or what's in the stars for you, man?
Well, I'll just briefly state, I met this really wonderful girl. She was just on Nox Mente recently. Her name's
Mm.
She is a metallurgist, and she made me this pendant. It's a meteorite on a 1966 pound shilling, and it's same year that Secret Agent Man came out. But anyways, a lot of things. Yeah, she's super cool. And you said in the stars, we were just reading our comparative natal charts, and it begins with and ends with fate has smiled on this relationship. So I don't know. We were just hanging out, and you asked me what's in the stars. That apparently is happening right now.
Awesome. Well, I'm
I was
glad.
focused. Oh, thank you.
Glad to hear it, my friend. Glad to see that the stars are being kind to you, because they haven't been kind to me. Send me some of that stardust. But
I'll send it right your way, sir.
and you said Secret Agent Man?
Yeah, I did. It's a good song.
Oh, I thought you meant, wasn't that the show before The Prisoner, Vance?
Yes, it was Patrick McGowan. Some people think that The Prisoner was the follow-on to Secret Agent, but that's a controversy.
Well, there you go. Well, we'll have to look at the stars for that. But anyway, well, why don't we get to the main event, to Vanessa? Let's talk about the Sumerians. And to start out with, maybe to familiarize the audience, tell us about the pantheon or the cosmology of the Sumerians, and how old is it at first? And then again, what was their cosmology?
Well, the Sumerians were around before the Babylonians, so we're talking, 4,000 years ago. All right, well, 4,000 BC, so, a little more than 4,000 years ago. Closer to what it would be, like 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, something like that. The Sumerian pantheon is primarily focused around, so there's a lot of deities, like a lot. In fact, they've got kind of the nickname of the land of like 2,000 gods or something, because there's so many. Because in a lot of respects, it's very animist. Like everything has a god. The beer you're drinking has a god. The trees outside your window has a god. Everything has a god. But that doesn't mean they're important gods per se. And so the pantheon primarily focuses on the seven who decree fate. And the ones that are closest to them, so their family, and the ones that they deal with on a regular basis. And those gods are Enlil, Innana, Ninhursag, Enki, Ninurta, Utu, and Nana. Innana is the goddess of change and creativity and wisdom and sex and warfare. Enki is the god of wisdom and drinking a bit too much and the procreative aspects of sex and the primordial soup. Then Enlil, his name literally means Lord Wind. He's the god of the wind, the god of the atmosphere, storms, rain, all that sort of stuff. Then there's Ninurta, who's the god of thunder and also the champion of the gods and is the sort of mercurial figure, doing all the like rushing around on the behalf of the other gods. Nana is the god of the moon, and he is the god of creativity and insanity and dreams and all those sort of like nighttime associated type concepts. Then Ninhursag is the goddess of the earth and of nature. Her name literally means Lady of the Great Mountain, so she's also really associated with mountains. Then let's see, which one did I miss? Utu. Utu is the god of the sun and the god of justice and exorcisms. And the concept of to shed light on something is very much his domain.
Interesting. And basically, you might say there wasn't it. Was there a grand drama in things? Any changes that really shook the gods up, or is it basically? I guess they were kind of like the Greek gods. They had their agendas and so forth.
Yeah, very much so. And there was constant like back and forth drama, and each god had their kind of their own opinion on how to run things, and they would have fights and then make up and then have fights and then make up and all that sort of stuff, have sex with each other, all those kind of things typical to you know, your typical pagan pantheon.
Very exciting. And so tell us about the creation of humanity. I mean, as we've discussed and other scholars have noticed, there's my dog. Other scholars have noticed the story of Adam and Eve really has its roots with the Sumerians, right? Tell us about how humans came about.
Yeah, definitely. So the story where humans are created is Enki and Ninma, and Ninma is the name of Ninhursag before she became Ninhursag, because she was given the mountain as a gift, and then that became her name. But before that, she was called Ninma. And she creates humans from a lump of clay, who are then given life with water by Enki, the water of life, and the breath of life from Enlil. Though he doesn't really show up in that story too much, though there's holes in it, so maybe it's in one of those holes. But basically, they create humans to be the slaves of the gods, to do the work of the gods on Earth. And humans are meant to be like essentially the curators of nature, to take care of nature and take care of like the animals and stuff, and farm things and plant things and keep nature up. Of course, we've done a horrible job at that. But so they don't just create one or two like in the Genesis account, but rather they create a whole like town's worth of people, including all different genders, including third genders and trans people and people who have disabilities and stuff. And each one, no matter who they are given a purpose, given something to do in their society. And they basically build up the Sumerian society, which, you know, you think of Sumerian society and you assume that it's like primitive and there's no rights and there's just a king that rules everything. But actually, at least before they started getting conquered by other nations, they were actually democratic and had a bicameral assembly similar to the United States. And they had their leader, the En, there's that word again, was actually elected once a year. And they only would even elect one when they felt like they had a crisis on their hands, that they actually needed a leader. Otherwise, they would just leave it up to the assembly. And there was the two assemblies where you had the upper assembly, which was made up of aristocrats and clergy and people with well-to-do. And then the lower assembly was made up entirely of lower class people. So they kind of had an equal share in the ruling of things. And the N wasn't even just necessarily a male. There was some female N's that ruled throughout various times in history that we know about. So it was actually a much more, it wasn't perfect. They did have slavery, though it wasn't the kind of chattel slavery that we think of today, like that they had in the American South, but rather it was debt slavery. So, you would owe a debt and you'd become a slave for X amount of time until you paid it off. Essentially, it was employment, but you didn't have your choice in the employer. It was whoever you owed money to. But once you paid it off, you were good and you could become freed again. So, of course, all that changed over the years as they slowly got conquered, first by the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, both of which who adapted their beliefs but put their own spin on it, kind of like how the Romans did to the Greeks. So you get Babylonian names for all the Sumerian gods. So like Innana becomes Ishtar, Enki becomes Ea, etc., etc.
Fascinating indeed. And Vince, why don't we get to some questions early? Any questions for Vanessa?
Yeah, in fact, we do. One of the questions was about their language. Was it a kind of an isolated language from Indo-European, similar to Etruscan? Did they have their own isolated language?
Yeah. After they got conquered by the Akkadians, Akkadian became the state language, and Sumerian essentially just kind of fell out of use and was replaced by the Semitic language Akkadian, and later by the Babylonian dialect of the same language. So as a result, they were an language isolate, and they didn't really have, there were no other civilizations that really spoke their language. So
though we have it, we still have it recorded though in their cuneiform and so forth. Is their language still present in that form?
Yeah, definitely. There's like over 2,000 tablets just in the British Museum of cuneiform written down, and only a small fraction of that have even been translated at this point. But their language survived in a form through Babylonian because they were really good at like keeping records, and they had like whole libraries with dictionaries between the two languages and stuff, because they kept up, they kept records of all the old stuff, and they would put their own twist on it and make their own versions to use as part of their rituals, but they would, keep archives of the old stuff. So we have that, and that's actually how we figured out how to translate Sumerian, because there was a sort of Rosetta Stone that went from Persian to Old Persian to Babylonian, if I remember right. And then from that, they were able to then use these dictionaries to figure out Sumerian.
Got another one too. Let's see, which one is next? Do the Apkallu sages hold any sort of authority when it comes to proto-Hermetic / Gnostic ideas, gnosis, or wisdom?
I've heard that argument before, but I feel like there is a much stronger case to be made with Innana and her stealing of the tablets of the Meh. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. The me tablets from Enki and giving them to humanity in a sort of like divine spark of Sophia type of story. So I would think, if anything, that would be more likely the case. The seven sages are more specifically related to things related to boats and fishing and stuff related to the water. Though later on they end up becoming more generalized and do medicine and exorcism, which were the same thing in those days. People who were doctors would know both traditional, what we think of as medicine, and exorcism. They were seen as the same thing. So you would first check, okay, is this person actually possessed by a demon, or are these more mundane sicknesses? And if it's with a demon, then deal with that. And if it's, more mundane sickness, they would prescribe, take, X amount of whatever herbal remedy or whatever it was.
Yeah,
So
definitely back up a little bit. As you said, Innana, maybe unpack a little bit of that, because as you say, the story of Innana is really the first Prometheus story in history, right? But at the same time, it's also a Sophianic story too.
right. So Enki is kind of a complicated character. He's both the god of wisdom, but also a drunkard. He's both the guy who created the world order, but also a character who's willing to shirk it in order to help humanity when he feels like they're being treated unfairly. He's kind of complicated. So, but he's also the god who not only created the Mies, but the god who guards them. And he was guarding them on behalf of Enlil, who is the most. It changes throughout history who's the head of the pantheon, but most of the time it's Enlil. And at the very least, no matter what, he's always a very important god. And so Enlil definitely didn't want humans to get their hands on the Mies, which were the tablets that kept the secrets of the gods and how magic and all the like technologies that the gods had and all of that sort of stuff. And so it was his job to guard them. And he and Innana were drinking buddies, and she gets him to get drunk off his ass. And I hope I'm allowed to cuss on here.
No, of course, feel free.
Okay. She gets him drunk off his ass, but she like maintains sobriety for the most part, and gets him to give her the tablets. And he does. With a cheer for each one. So, here's to Innana, here, have this tablet, here's to like over and over. And eventually he gives all of them and then blacks out. And so she's like, okay, I know what I'm going to do with these. She loads them up on a boat with her warrior princess priestess person, right hand girl who's like a strong warrior named Shuber, and they start heading down to the place where the humans live. And Enki in the meantime wakes up and doesn't remember what happened, but realizes the tablets are gone. His helper Izimud, who is the two-faced character, sort of like Janus, tells him, hey, you gave them to Innana and she made off with them. And he panics and starts creating all these monsters to send after her to try and stop her from making off with the tablets. Ninshuber proves more than capable of fighting off these monsters on behalf of Innana. She gets down to where the humans live, and she starts distributing them to humanity and teaching humans the secrets of magic and all the secrets of like technology and how to read and write and all the secrets of the gods. Enki by this point catches up, realizes what she's doing. He's like, actually I'm okay with this, and starts helping her out, but warns humans that, with all this technology and power and magic and sort of that stuff, there are a lot of, essentially the with great power comes great responsibility sort of line, and warns humans that, with all this comes a lot of, potential to harm yourselves and harm others, and to be careful, basically.
And there you have it. And I guess we should get this out of the way. You're bringing up Enki and all that. We definitely want to loop back later to Innana and her descent into the underworld. But obviously, the Anunnaki and Enki and making humans their helpers brings the whole UFO alien thing to light. And it's still around, probably stronger than ever. What are your views on this, Vanessa? I remember with Acharya, I used to bring that up, and she used to get so angry because she thought she believed in UFOs, but she thought the Anunnaki were not, and she would read the text, and she'd always lose a lot of followers because people take this very seriously. So I hope I don't lose a lot of followers. But what's your take on the Anunnaki being aliens?
Well, so my position has become more complicated because I no longer think of like what we think of as like aliens, the UFO knots, the folks that fly around on flying saucers and show up and abduct people. I don't think of them as like actually being from space. I see them as being effectively interdimensional from the spirit world, from the parallel world where spirits exist. And if I take that view on it, I don't think it's the Anunnaki, which is most likely how that's actually pronounced rather than Anunnaki. I don't think it's them, but I think it's definitely the demons that are so often prescribed against, because a lot of the descriptions, especially in, and I'm going to hold up the book, but I know audio listeners won't be able to see that. It's the Witchcraft Series Malclue. It's a series of exorcism tablets that were written by the Babylonians based on earlier Sumerian texts that are meant to get rid of evil spirits and curses and basically any sort of spiritual attacks on a person. And among the description are this description of the Galu or Gala. I'm not entirely, I'm really bad about these pronunciations, especially Babylonian, because I'm not as familiar with it. But they are, their name literally means Caesar or one who seizes. And the description that's given so much mirrors the description of like fairy abductions in medieval times and in modern day UFO abductions, like, you know, the Greys. So much so that I'm convinced now that it's the same beings just being described in the terms of the day. So now, you know, we're not so big on mythology and demons and stuff. Now we're more on like technology, and we assume it's aliens, so they take on the guise of space aliens. So from that point of view, you know, I definitely don't think the Zecharia Sitchin thing is true, because, I mean, he mostly got his ideas by using outdated sources from the 1800s when they could translate like 5 symbols out of a tablet and make wild assumptions based on it, and B, actively misrepresents information, tablets, and other things to fit his narrative. However, I do think that the beings that people are thinking as the Greys, as these space aliens that interfere with humans and screw with their lives and all this other stuff, are represented in the Sumerian tablets and definitely have a presence. And specifically, those demons are the demons whose job it is to make humans' lives miserable for the sake of the underworld, and for the sake of, like, their job is to, like, they're essentially the thing that comes before the Grim Reaper. They're the ones who drag you to the underworld to be judged by the 7 judges of the dead. So, like, if you see them from the perspective of, you know, they're trying to decide if it's time to kill you or not, everything takes on a whole much more sinister sort of outlook.
But yeah, but taking you down, I thought they had a view of the underworld like a shell or something. You weren't judged. Everybody ended up in this gray, shitty place.
Well, yes and no. So the city of the dead, there were palaces, there were places where you would end up. So it was much like our cities today. There were places where things were actually pretty good, and there were places where things sucked. The best example I have of this is actually an excerpt from the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu goes into the underworld, because he's a wild man. He is, you know, half demon, essentially, half person, so he can enter and exit the underworld without dying, whereas the human, or well, demigod, it's kind of vague in the Sumerian. In the Babylonian, he's definitely a demigod, but it's a lot more up to interpretation in the Sumerian. In any case, he can't go down there without dying, so he sends his, you know, best friend slash sort of gay lover-ish slave sort of thing down there to, because they're playing some game with a mallet and a ball, which makes me think of croquet. And he like knocks the ball too far and throws his mallet, and they end up falling into the underworld. And so he sends down
I hate when that happens.
to fetch the stuff. And after he comes back out, Gilgamesh asks him, oh hey, all these people that were friends and relatives of mine that are in the underworld, how did they fare? And it gives a big huge list of this person who did all these great things in his life, he's living it up and lives in the palace of the underworld. But this other guy who did basically nothing and wasted his life, now he's sitting around as a beggar. And the person who was burned alive went up to the heavens, meaning the clouds, and became a poltergeist. And the worst thing you could do is be so bad that you get rejected from the underworld altogether, and that's how you end up becoming a hungry ghost. So if you're like such a jerk that they don't want you in the city, they'll send you back to Earth as a ghost, and you just become a hungry ghost to mess. And like all you can hope for is to mess with other humans to find some semblance of comfort.
Oh boy. Nate, what do you think about the whole Anunnaki alien thing, or do you have a question for Vanessa, or tell us what's on your mind?
Yeah, I think that an interesting question would be, what do they have in their pantheons or in their descriptions of the spiritual world, of walk-ins, or of communication and manipulation by spirit beings? And how would they talk about this? And maybe what kind of gods would be related to that kind of activity? That's the question I would ask.
So do you mean like summoning spirits or magic? Like, I'm not entirely sure what you're asking.
Yeah, summoning spirits would be part of that. Just the entire concept of spirit possession and just interdimensional, interaction in that general kind of thing. How would that be dealt with in this storyline here?
Yeah, so interference both by the hungry ghosts of relatives as well as demons was... Now remember, demon here is pre-Christian demon, so not like demon as in the spawn of Satan that are trying to hurt humanity, but rather just spirits with their own agenda. And there were multiple classifications of them. Some more harmful, some more helpful. So interference by spirits of all kinds, whether it be, post-humans or by, demons, were a big deal. And the aforementioned Malklu was all about dealing with that sort of thing. So necromancy was a thing that happened. It was kind of... there's not a huge lot of references to it, so it was kind of something that's seen as like frowned upon, but it was definitely done, and we know that, like, it was something that was kind of like a last resort sort of deal. But I actually have a copy of a paper that has a translation of a necromancy tablet, and it actually uses... they call upon Utu, the god of the sun, who's again associated with exorcism, to bring up the soul of a human, post-life human, from the underworld to possess a human skull so that they can talk to them. And I actually took that tablet and like remixed it with some stuff I pulled from medieval grimoires and put together a whole little miniature grimoire for a Mesopotamian method for summoning spirits, and I published that in, 2 months ago, I believe, of the Peacock Goat Review magazine that I write for.
I think I remember you talking about that. Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely a thing. And if you're interested, I highly recommend checking that out. Other than that, also this book, Malklu, Witchcraft Series Malklu by Zavi Abush. I'm probably butchering that name. And that's a big, huge collection of exorcism tablets, which remind me heavily of a lot of the material in the Greek magical papyri, which, of course, as Gnostics are probably well aware, shares a lot of the material with the Gnostic texts, to bring this full circle. So especially the headless rite, or Stele of Jew as it's sometimes referred to.
Oh, wow.
So I actually, once again, took that material and remixed it with the aforementioned Stele of Jew to make a Mesopotamian version of the headless rite, which again is in the Peacock Art Review. But yeah, definitely exorcism, witchcraft, and there was even a goddess who was in charge of, who was like the goddess of witches, and I'm spacing on her name right now. I know it's in this book, but she's one of Innana's daughters, and she's called upon in that regard quite a few times. In fact, that's pretty much her name to fame. So yeah, certainly, and possession was a big concern, as was sleep paralysis type interference, demons that would interrupt people's sleep and do all sorts of horrible things to them while they're trying to sleep was a huge concern. And that was, something that they would go to a professional exorcist to do, who would dress like those the Alapu, the fish people, the seven sages that we talked about earlier. They would actually dress up like that. At least some of them would, when they were doing those professional exorcism rites. I was trying to flip through here and see if I could find her name, because I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but I can't seem to find it. I'm not going to spend any more time looking for it.
Well, if you remember, let us know. And Vince, do you have a comment or question? You or the Pooch have a question, or from the audience, or?
Yeah, Foxy wants to know what the relationship between the ancient Egyptians and the Sumerians was.
Early on, none. Later in the time period, they became trading partners. So there was definitely some things. The most obvious example I can think of was the god Bes was imported and became one of the Sumerian pantheon at some point. So there was definitely quite a bit of like cultural exchange going on, and some of their ideas were shared back and forth. But that's definitely more later in time. But definitely, especially on into the Babylonian period, as trading became easier and transportation became more established and roads became more well traveled. Definitely, as time went on, there was more and more trading and cultural exchange between the two of them. And if I remember right, there's actually a picture in an Egyptian either temple or tomb of Ishtar, which is the Babylonian name for Innana, being in among a bunch of Egyptian deities. I don't know too much about it. I'm not super studied on Egyptian, so I don't know how much the influence was there. I know there was definitely trading going on, though.
Yeah, thanks. Foxy says thanks. Okay, guy.
Okay. Then people are saying your dog is matrixing or whatever. It's going back into the matrix, so that's cute.
Right.
Well, maybe it will have a question later. So Vanessa, why don't we get to, of course, our favorite goddess, or at least one of my favorite goddesses, Innana. Again, we talked about her being Promethean. She's obviously this chthonic goddess that goes down into the underworld. And and I guess a two-part question. There's always that picture of her. I even used it on the promo material with whatever bird feet and all that. I think you said that's not Innana. And two, maybe tell the audience that might not know the parallels with Innana and other goddesses that you might have inspired, like Sophia.
Sure. So yeah, that statue, we don't actually know what goddess that statue
It's
represents.
not Lilith, as some people have keep saying.
Right. Lilith was much later. Like Lilith, there was some like story fragments that would later go on to like inspire parts of the Lilith myth, but had nothing to do with Innana for one. And like Lilith as a concept, as we think of her today, was not a thing in the Sumerian pantheon. however, so that statue, definitely not Lilith, possibly Innana. We don't know for certain, but the best evidence we have so far is that she is Ninlil, who is the female counterpart to Enlil, and they actually rule like as equals. So Enlil controls the west and east winds, and Ninlil controls the north and south. And I actually have a replica of that statue up on my wall. I'm looking at it right now on the other side of the room. But in any case, there is it wasn't inscribed. It didn't say what it was, and while we have other examples, they also weren't inscribed. We do have a depiction slightly different of a goddess with similar posture, similar wings, positioned in a similar manner, which is Ninlil. And so best evidence suggests it's probably Ninlil. But we do have statues of Innana that we know for certain are Innana because they were inscribed as such. The most famous being one where she has a lion on a leash, which I actually used as a basis for my own altar to Innana. I feel like you had another part of the question, but I can't remember.
Relating her to maybe relate her to Sophia, and maybe.
Oh, right. So yeah, definitely. She makes her way as an influence throughout time, to the Babylonian version of her, Ishtar, to the Canaanite goddess. She kind of influences both Asherah and Anat in different ways. She influenced the Greek Athena, Aphrodite, Astarte. There's even some suggestion that her or some earlier goddess that influenced her in the first place, being the influence of Durga from the Egyptian the Hindu pantheon. As for the Egyptian, Sekhmet most likely is the one that she influenced. There's a lot of parallels, including the lion iconography. So definitely throughout time, she's been a huge influence and continues to this day to be a huge influence. And so as to the Sophia myth, there are numerous parallels, from the aforementioned giving of the tablets to humanity, essentially the secrets of magic and the spirit world, to the descent, which parallels Sophia's descent, and also as her role as being the illuminator of humanity to initiates and magical traditions. So we're in the Gnostic magical schools. We see, especially in the ones more closely related to the Greek magical papyri, her being a part of the initiation process, learning about her and interacting with her and all that sort of stuff. Definitely Innana's temple was a huge influence on the magic in the region. Some of the most prominent Sumerian writers were intimately connected with the temple of Innana, all that sort of stuff. So definitely there are more parallels than I could easily lay down in one conversation.
Well, to me, it's a great, and you don't find it often, as you have goddesses like Innana, who's the first. You've got Sophia, Persephone. These are the goddesses who go to the underworld for a reason. Of course, it's the great tale of the soul's descent into matter and what it can do. But this is actually more of an exception than a rule, right? It's not, again, there's very few goddesses who have to go these passions and transformations.
Yeah, definitely. There's a specific class, and all of them seem to be related archetypally, and seem to be doing it for similar motivations. So, and it also represents. It's not just a story for an external thing or for understanding history or a mythologically encoded history, but it's also psychology, and the dark night of the soul, and the process of initiation, and the process of like the alchemical process of becoming a better you. You know, it's because I mean the seven in my own personal practice, I've been working through the seven spheres, the Trithemian system as presented by Rufus Opus, and I've been like kind of giving it my own Mesopotamian twist. And you know, it's the seven classical spheres of the geocentric or model of the universe. So you know, the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And it's you know, initiating to each one, learning their influence and all that sort of stuff. And Innana, in her descent, she goes through 7 gates to get into the underworld, and each one she has to strip off an article of clothing in order to be allowed to pass. And I feel like in a lot of ways that's very symbolic of the initiation process, going through each of the 7 spheres and having to face different aspects of your psychology and, you know, let go aspects of your ego in order to pass and become a better person.
Agreed. So you're a devotee of Innana. Tell us more about your practice, or what is she to your life?
Definitely. She's kind of the person or the goddess I go to most often for guidance on where I'm going in life. And I have an altar to her, and now also, as of last week, an altar to Ninhursag in my apartment. And I do offerings in front of that. But then I've also been working through, like I said, the 7 spheres, taking Rufus Opus's approach, but, you know, adding my own Sumerian twist. And so I've been doing initiation rituals, which involve essentially like asking each of these deities who represent these spheres for their help and guidance and lessons to become a better person and to better my life and all that sort of stuff. The one that I just finished was Saturn, which is Enki, and that was really intense, especially doing it during Saturn retrograde. Lots of nightmares and having to face like really dark things. Also, I literally went into a cave. I went and visited Ohio Caverns. So like very chthonic in a very literal sense. And as of this week, I just did Mercury, which is Ninurta. And that has only started to play out in my life. So before that, I've done Utu, I've done which is the god of the sun, I've done Innana, which is of course Venus, I've done, let's see which one I feel like there's been one other. I'm trying to think what it was. Oh, Nana, the god of the moon. So I don't have too many left to go. Just I think just Jupiter. I'm sorry.
Jupiter retrograde. There we are, and here we are. Vince, any questions or remarks on your end over there with you, the temple of the gods behind you?
Yeah, we got a couple. One of them we touched on just a moment ago. In terms of psychology, Vanessa, what do you think about the Jungian connection? Can you relate the Jungian archetypes and Jungian psychology to what the ancient Sumerians were dealing with?
Oh, absolutely. Very much especially the 7 who decree fate definitely represent different aspects of psychology. You know, from Nana representing the creative aspects to Innana representing, you know, the drive to, you know, oh, Nurgle, that was the one I forgot. I did Nurgle as well. He's Mars, the god of war and also the god of disease. So, which oddly enough, he actually taught me about Buddhism. You would not expect that, but that's what happened. Sorry, a little derail there, but yeah, like he definitely represents, you know, the more destructive and militaristic aspects, but also discipline. You know, Enlil representing the one's executive functions and drive, and also generosity. That was the other aspect that I failed to mention before. Enki being more of the restrictions we put on ourselves, and also like our fears and both our willingness and unwillingness to face things that terrify us. And Ninhursag representing like our nurturing, our motherly aspects, our fatherly aspects, our raising of children, but also like the hearth and home, and taking care of your family and your home and your environment, and having a garden, all those sort of things that relate to those sort of aspects of life.
Shadow, what would that be, their underworld, as or the who ruled the, I forget who ruled the underworld?
That would be Ereshkigal, who is the person that Innana faced down in her descent into the underworld. And definitely Ereshkigal would very much be the shadow, but not the shadow quite in the same Jungian sense, because whereas the Jungian sense sort of is seen as somewhat of like purely a negative thing, she's seen as kind of like a balancing thing. Because like she's not the one who brings about death. She's not actually malicious. She's just the one who cares for the dead, the one who, rules over the world of the dead. So in this case, the shadow would with her being the shadow, it wouldn't be so much like something to be overcome or something to integrate with, but rather something to accept and like learn to nurture those darker aspects of ourselves to make them not have to be dark, if that makes sense. I don't know if that quite made sense, but it's hard to put into words.
I get the idea. Yeah. Also, here's a simple question: who's the correspondent to Jehovah? You think the Hebrew Jehovah?
Well, kind of dual role between Enki and Enlil, depending on the situation. So, Enlil is very much generous, but also he can be cruel, and he has a very strong-willed and like my way or the highway kind of attitude. But he's also very generous at the same time. His head's not always in the right place. Enki, on the other hand, is a lot more deep and thoughtful, but at the same time is also a drunkard and can, go on drunk tirades, but also like, black out and then go like, what the heck did I do? And panic and make mistakes. So like both of them represent both the positive and negative aspects in different cases. So if you kind of like remix the two and take bits and pieces of both, you kind of get the God of the Old Testament.
Very interesting. Nate, do you have a question or comment or anything?
Yeah, two-headed snake here. Two authors to mention. Vanessa, I'm wondering specifically if you're familiar with the works of Peter Levenda. The Maklus come up a lot in the Necronomicon, which he absolutely did not write, but I guess he came out recently and finally said he did, whatever. So the Maklus sound familiar, and that's a summoning book. And then he also wrote another book, the same author, Peter Levenda, also wrote another book about using the Merkava or the Hekhalot's technology. It was called Stairway to Heaven. And he talks about moving between the different planes and realms. And the reason I'm joining this author together is to ask you, because the Necronomicon's largely about moving through those 7 gates and stuff like that. I was just wondering if you're familiar with his work, or if you could see a tradition of this interdimensional, which you said you're using Rufus Opuses and you're putting a Mediterranean spin on it of your own. My question is, where do you, maybe you could comment on this. The second part is, I just wanted to mention Graham Hancock. Maybe that should come up later. But that was my question for you, Vanessa, directly.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about Hancock later for sure. But
So for the audio listeners, I'm sitting here holding a copy of the
I'm
Necronomicon. I
gonna
definitely
BO-booty.
am familiar with it. I have a kind of like amused but love-hate relationship with it. As a thing written for entertainment purposes and as a book that is, kind of tongue-in-cheek and, meant to fit in with the greater Lovecraftian kind of world, it's great. As a book of magic, it surprisingly works, which is kind of weird, but from a historical perspective, he gets a lot wrong. And I think he does that on purpose. I don't think he actually meant it to be a serious book or meant it to have any kind of historicity. Like, he definitely borrows from a lot of the actual historical stuff, but he also makes up a lot of stuff. And also gets a
borrows
lot
from
of stuff
theosophy
wrong.
too. Heavily borrows from theosophy.
Yeah, and he definitely gets a lot of stuff wrong. He sees like, one of the things is they approach Marduk's 50 names as being like all separate things, like separate gods and separate like underlings, but like in the actual historical Marduk, those were actually just like epithets, like different names for him. Like if you think of like the Christian God, how he is often described, with all these different, Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, all these different. I'm struggling to remember all of them because it's been so long ago since I've looked at all that. But it's basically very much that. They would have been used in hymns and praise poetry. They wouldn't have really been called upon as separate individual, separate pieces. So, I mean, but I don't think he intended it for that, and that's totally okay because it's not trying to be scholarly. My only caveat with it is when people read it and then think they actually know anything about the Sumerian or Babylonian stuff, and it also pulls freely from both and calls it all Sumerian, mixes Babylonian and Sumerian stuff, and there are clear lines to be drawn there. So I find it somewhat annoying, especially as a Sumerian reconstructionalist, the people who come in and then start asking stuff about the Necronomicon as if it's some sort of scholarly work when it's definitely not. It's clearly meant to be, a novelty, a conversation piece rather than something that is meant to be taken any kind of seriously. Though surprisingly, from what I've not tried it myself, but from thumbing through it, it's like there's definitely, this person knew what they were writing. They knew magic. They knew what they were getting into. Like there's a lot of this is clearly pulled from medieval grimoires. But from people I've talked to who've dabbled in it, it actually surprisingly works as a book of magic, which is amusing. I don't know what to make of that, but I find it incredibly amusing. But it definitely pulls heavily more, not so much from actual Sumerian stuff, other than just like deity names to pull from, treated like the big huge list of demons were in the grimoires. It's definitely heavily pulling from the Kabbalah and from theosophy, as Miguel mentioned, and also from Kabbalah. But heavily pulling from medieval grimoires, like the Key of Solomon and the Lemengelian and the Book of Honorius the Third and all that sort of stuff.
Awesome, and good question. And also, we were having a conversation. We have to bring in the Archons. What would the show be without the Archons? You got to blame it on these aliens or whatever. But I think we've talked about, you said that the Archons do have a connection or a parallel to Mesopotamian. That would be these Lilu, these owl demons.
Well, that's specifically the I couldn't think of the word for a second. The Greys, the Euphonauts, the bedroom invaders that grab you in the night and all that sort of stuff. The sleep paralysis type demons, those sort of entities. That's what those are. But more to your point, like as for the archons in general, definitely both the Anunnaki when they're in bad moods, because I mean people petition them. There's like, altars aren't just, it's not, Christians will approach their God and just assume he's all good and all loving and assume he's got the best interest. Whereas someone from Mesopotamia will be like, okay, I need to get this God on my side because if he hates me, my life is fucked. So a lot of it is, begging favors, trying to do things to raise your status, and so the gods aren't necessarily seen as all friendly or all loving. There's something they represent the forces of of nature, and those can be fickle, and they can send 14 tornadoes to your home state.
Yeah, like
Not
that.
specifically because that just happened this week to my state of Ohio.
Wow.
It's not always great, and the gods aren't always meant like someone that you want to trust completely. Though in the Sumerian pantheon, you did have your ancestors to look to, the ones who actually passed into Kor, the ones who have proven their worth, and also you would have a personal god who is your your patron, who would be a little bit more in your favor. And then you'd have your personal demon, who was essentially your spirit guide. Essentially the same idea as like the holy guardian angel in Thelema. Your personal spirit guide that you would turn to before anything else, and they're the most likely to have your best interest at heart. But yeah, so there's the archons as the gods, and them as both oppressive forces, but they can also be good too, if you get their favor. I mean, those rituals that I was doing, a big part of it is giving offerings, trying to be like, hey, here's some beer, you want to throw some lessons my way. And yes, I used wheat beer because that's what the Sumerians drank.
Yeah. but here's a question. You obviously, because we've been talking and interacting and you're part of the groups, you also have an affinity to the Gnostic worldview, where we're basically prisoners trapped in this world and all that. Which one, or what is your worldview, or do you have a fusion between Sumerian and Gnostic? I mean,
definitely a fusion. But to finish my point and to bring it home in that respect, so there's the gods, but then there's also the lesser gods, the Ajiji, which were a lot more fickle and a lot more willing to just do whatever the heck they want, because they weren't the seven who decree fate. They weren't the big ones in charge, so they could get away with more stuff. And so they are even more fickle and hard to get. And they would be, the ones doing random storms here and there, or suddenly being a poltergeist, or whatever else. But then as back to Enki's whole purpose for creating humanity was for us to be the slaves of the gods. That aspect is definitely there. Of course, as I mentioned, the concept of slave isn't completely without autonomy, completely to just be nothing but it's not like slavery as we think of it in the South, but as it was in the American South, I should say. But it was still slavery. I mean, you're still their slaves at the end of the day. So that concept is still very much there. And it's kind of like, I kind of see the Mesopotamian approach to the gods as, you're worshiping them not because you necessarily 100% are wanting to praise them, but rather because it gets their favor and you want that positive fate. You want them to decree you a good fate. You don't want them to send you a plague. So
or a tornado.
It's kind of like giving your chocolate cupcake to the prison guard to try and have him not beat you as hard today.
Well, a slave is a slave.
Exactly. So there's definitely that aspect to it too. Of course, it's not all negative, and so to answer, yeah, very much a kind of a mixture of the two. I'm not 100% willing to say that the gods are always right, but at the same time, they have been very helpful to me, and I can't say that that's not been the case, because it certainly has. So.
Well, there you go. There you go. And yeah, talking about tornadoes, I was reading a story today where the governor of Kansas was telling people to stop shooting tornadoes. I was like, I love America. Only in the United States. Yeehaw! I'll show you good, you know.
Come back here, you varmint.
You can really see that. You can see people shooting their guns.
I could totally see that. That's hilarious. But yeah, I mean, actually, that's a good example. Like,
yeah, messing with the gods.
I mean, Dayton got hit the hardest with those recent tornadoes here in Ohio, but my hometown of Vandalia was completely spared. So, like, we got hit with nothing pretty much, except for a bit of a strong thunderstorm. But everywhere around here got hit. So it's like a little this, a little that. Like, we got hit by a horrible storm, but I was safe. So.
Fickle nature and fickle gods. Any other questions, Vance? Still from the audience out there?
It's been quiet, so get your questions in there, folks, if you want them.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, while we get some questions, Nate, as I said, I want to hear about you and Graham Hancock, and maybe tie this in.
That'll be, the tie-in will be easy because I'll bring up the book about what is it? Oh geez, History Starts with Sumeria, I think is the name of the book that gets brought up. So Graham's been doing a talk around at different Barnes and Nobles. He has this deal with them where there's an extra chapter in his book. So if you're going to get his book, America Before, all of my books, I take dust jackets off. I just like to hold a book. So America Before, otherwise, you know, you expect a different look, whatever. America Before has an extra chapter in it if you buy it at Barnes and Noble. It's like getting a bonus track on an old CD album when they used to do that. But so, and I can say the appendix it's an Appendix D, and it's actually really cool. And there's a picture in the appendix of a celebrant or an aspirant or an initiate into the mystery tradition of the time. And we're talking, these are the Alabama and, like, I suppose Mississippi plains of America. And it shows a star beaming into the aspirant's forehead, right? And so they're talking about this old star belief that if someone prayed to a star, it would then control their fate. And he's showing a connection between this civilization in the Americas with Egypt, hence why it was America Before, because he's showing all these great, huge connections. He talks about how there's populations in certain areas that could not be there if the traditional migration route across the Bering Straits was true. Anyways, maybe ask a very pointed question because there's just a lot of information in there. You know what I mean?
Awesome. So you've already read the book and you saw the talk?
Okay, so just to make it brief, yeah, I met him on Thursday, the past, when I got his book, and it was just a really great event where he has this set kind of talk that he's been giving around at these Barnes and Nobles. Dark Journalist did a special presentation with him live at a church in Harvard, and I saw them. It was amazing, and I saw them again the Saturday after. So it was nice to be able to see Graham here and then here, and it was just really a nice event. And I don't know, I think one of the main concerns, if I was just to give a main takeaway from the event, we need to stop throwing so much money at pointless wars and pointless pollution of this planet and start putting it at important things like maybe looking at certain comets and certain kinds of threats to the earth that could destroy us in a cataclysm. And so that's one idea. You know, let's focus our resources in a more constructive manner. It just may be our lives at stake. You know, not to put too fine a point on it. Comet Research Group is one place to go for that. But anyways, it was a really great set of talks, and I don't want to chew up any more time. I don't know what else to say besides there was a part about it to tie it in where he was talking about how there's all this evidence, how we laud the whole kind of Sumerian epoch as being such a huge cornerstone in our history when, like, with Gordon White starships and Gobekli Tepe and stuff like that. There's so much more to the story, and it's really great to see those horizons expanding. And I think it's there's a lot more room out there for people to do some digging. You know what I mean?
So it's very interesting that you mention tying your fate to one of the stars, because I just happened to have come across this morning while I was thumbing through Malclu, and I have it right here. And I should preface this by mentioning that the Sumerians didn't know the difference between a planet and a star. They were all just stars to them. So Zikuruda magic in the presence of the moon. You have performed this against me, may Gira release. Zikuruda magic in the presence of Jupiter. You have performed this against me, you have released. I'm going to skip those repeating parts for the sake of brevity. In the presence of Cygnus, in the presence of Lyra, in the presence of Leo, in the presence of Ursa Major, in the presence of Scorpio, in the presence of Orion, in the presence of Centaurus, by means of snake, mongoose, or dormouse, etc., etc., etc. So it's listing a whole bunch of different type of spells tying you to these various asterisms, and then asking Gira, who's the god of burning, essentially. He's the god of fire and of forge. I couldn't think of that word for a second. And of the forge, asking him to like burn those connections away. So it's interesting you're mentioning this magic to tie your fate to these stars, and here's the counter spell right here.
Well, the Gnostic way would you want to break away from the stars? That was the first thing, break away from fate. Or at least I guess the Valentinians, you wanted to replace the stars with an apostle or whatever it is. So I would say, Vince, any questions from the stars in the chat room?
Yes, here's a good one. Where along the line, if it wasn't in Sumeria, maybe later, if you know, did the idea of human sacrifice come in? Because, I remember hearing a talk by our friend Bob Price about the human sacrifice and Abraham, the Abrahamic story, and that actually that scenario came back from further back. So what can you say about that?
So best that I have come across, and I could be wrong because I haven't particularly had much of an interest in this subject, so I haven't looked into that deeply. But the only instance I have come across was a single instance of a king late in a late period, after they died, them having killed a whole ton of people to put in that king of that tomb, that king's tomb, to be with them in the afterlife to assist them. That's the only instance I'm aware of myself. There might be others that I'm simply unaware of, but I have a huge stack of books on this subject, and and I've read tons of academic papers and all this sort of stuff, and that's the only one instance I've come across. So it doesn't, if it was done, it was not done very often, and it would have definitely been seen as frowned upon, because you were meant to accept death, but you weren't meant to seek death. Seeking death was kind of seen as sacrilege to some degree. So
Well, but they didn't think they had to appease the gods with human life then. Egyptians, by the way, used to, their whole, entourage, I think, was buried with the pharaoh when he went, all his people,
no,
the good ones.
see, they would have seen that as kind of being an annoyance to the deities of the underworld, because now they have to process all these extra dead that show up at the gates. You were
Build
meant
a wall.
More guards.
you were meant to live your life in a way that pleased the gods, not so much. It wasn't really so much about your death, other than just accepting it, so you weren't an annoyance to the gods of the underworld when you get there. I swear I'm not dead. I'm still alive.
That's much better.
Yeah.
Python.
Other than just accepting your fate, and accepting your time when it comes. Other than that, like, it was more about how you live your life, and doing it in such a way that it pleases your god, the gods, especially whatever your personal god was, your patron. So I know it definitely happened, but that's the only one instance that I'm aware of, and I think it was kind of a one-off.
No, good to hear. Good to hear. Any other questions, Vince?
I don't see any. Hopefully I didn't miss any.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Vanessa, which I guess I should have asked earlier, but I just saw Lawrence Caruana's new video on Gnosticism, and it's a great video. My dog is making strange sounds behind me, but anyway, and he talks about obviously it's always so hard because the Gnostics drew from Egyptian, Greek lore, and all that. But in his presentation, I think he talks very well how the cosmology is very close to the Sumerian, because he said there was 12 signs of the zodiac, there was 60 demons here, and they had 360 and all that. Would you agree with that assessment, or is basically most cultures in those days pretty much borrowed or were influenced by the Sumerians?
No, definitely I would agree, and I would say that it's a direct influence, and I kind of touched on it earlier, but I didn't really explain it in much detail. The Greek magical papyri, which of course, shares both the culture and influence and some of the same texts as some of the Gnostic sects, has a very clear Babylonian influence that's just not as obvious as the Greek or the Egyptian, because the Greek and the Egyptian, their deities are listed. There's very few, though there are some, such as Ereshkigal, the goddess of the dead, that are mentioned. But the actual magic that they're doing, a lot of them, a lot of the spells, especially the ones with Greek deity names, are almost identical or very similar to magic texts that I've come across in my study of Mesopotamian magic. And we know that the Greeks learned astrology from the Babylonians, and the way we know that is because we have tablets where it's Greek on one side and Babylonian on the other, where they had gone, that were, that they found in between the passage between Greece and Babylon. So we know that they went there down to Babylon to study astrology, and definitely Babylonian astrology and Egyptian astrology elements both show up in the Greek magical papyri. So I would say that there's a pretty good chance that at least some of the Gnostics actually went and studied in Babylonian schools and were familiar, but would just more often than not either attach, Gnostic names to things, or attach Greek names to things, or whatever else, but would retain the archetype and just simply name swap. Because as I said, there's, not only is, as you mentioned, the worldview surprisingly similar, but also the practices are surprisingly similar. I mean, like I mentioned before, the the headless rite and Mauklu have a lot in common, especially from like a what they were for standpoint, which is, primarily exorcism, to get rid of all the negative spirit attachments that you have. So definitely, I would say that there's a direct influence.
How about Hermes and Thoth and all that? Is that Enki or somebody else in the Sumerian as far as correspondence goes?
There's actually two deities that correspond from different sides. So from the messenger of the god side, you have I'm having trouble with words now. Ninurta, who is the champion of the gods and does the gods' bidding first and foremost. Is definitely running back and forth and doing all the dirty work, including fighting monsters to reclaim things that were stolen and all that sort of stuff. And then from the messenger of the god standpoint, you have that. And then as for the deity of writing and of scholarly works and that sort of thing, there is Nabu, and earlier there's a goddess who's, I think it's Nuska or something like that. I'm having trouble with remembering the name, but definitely she turns into the god Nabu in the Babylonian, and he is the god of writing and scholarly things and and all that sort of stuff, and money and commerce. Scribes were definitely the scribal arts were both, writing for messages and myths and stories, but also keeping tabs. They were hired for, finances and writing receipts and writing invoices and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's definitely direct parallels.
Oh, great. Thanks.
There you go. Had to. Yeah. And sometimes I'm at a work meeting and I'm like talking about some project and 5 minutes go by and unmute yourself, Miguel. I'm sure we've all been there with these conferences, but I am trying. Plus, my dog's making a lot of sounds. I hope she doesn't have an accident. I hope that's not what she's bothering me, but we shall find out. But Vanessa, it's interesting how, I mean, it's pretty much a fact that civilization was just sort of put, and then came the Sumerians, and so everything just sprouted out of nowhere. And like Nate was saying, you have the Göbekli Tepe, where somehow they looked at the stars and something was beamed down to them, some gnosis. I mean, do you think that's what happened? I mean, they got this amazing technology pretty fast from somewhere beyond.
I definitely think, I mean, I would say that the story of Innana giving the Mies to humanity is a mythologization of essentially what Philip K. Dick experienced: direct spirit contact, dumping like a huge info dump, like a download into the heads of people, and being like, "Look, now you know this stuff. Go do stuff."
Here's beer making. Here's astrology. Here's medicine. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So I definitely think it was a case like that. And I mean, even modern scientists, this information is somewhat buried, but there's actually a book coming out. I forget, I think it was talked about on Gordon White's podcast, but that a lot of our most famous scientists actually had their brilliant thing just kind of pop into their head one day with no explanation. As a fully formed idea. Like, we're still getting this today. I mean, rocketry was something that, Jack Parsons got through magic. So, I think direct revelation by the gods is something that we tend to overlook these days, but is still even very much a part of our lives now. We just, tend to call it inspiration and dismiss it without really examining it. But, I would definitely say that that's definitely probably the case. And I would say Innana is behind the majority. I mean, in the case of Jack Parsons, he was talking to this goddess named Babylon, and she's very much just Innana behind a mask, like, and not even trying very hard to cover that up.
Yeah, but I mean, it's interesting. The daughter of Fortitude, that God, what was his name? The court magician,
John Dee.
Yeah, the daughter of Fortitude's speech is just like Thunder the Perfect Mind. It's almost word for word. So it's definitely some primordial goddess, whether it's Babylon or not. It's this great archetype of wisdom and knowledge.
Yeah, and Thunder Perfect Mind itself is essentially a first-person version of a hymn to Innana from the Sumerian text written by Enheduanna, where she's, comparing Innana to all these different things, saying, this thing and its opposite are yours, Innana. And so it's essentially taking these things that she's attributing to Innana and turns it into, a first-person poem from the perspective of the goddess. I mean, I'm not saying they necessarily were taking the one from the other, but I think there's certainly a case to be made that there was probably some influence. But definitely that thread is there. At the very least, from an archetypal standpoint, the hymn to Innana, which is actually one of the ones included in the Literature of Ancient Sumer book that the Oxford University put out, which I highly recommend. It's actually one of the ones included. She says, Innana, you are, creation and dissolution. You are, being wealthy and being poor, being, all these opposites. So I definitely think that in the very least, the Thunder Perfect Mind archetype is carried by the Innana story, or carrier of the Innana story, I should say.
Indeed, a primordial story. And what do you think, Nate? Do you think we got this from the stars? Or do you think we had our second move in 1948 with Roswell, when our technology just shot up all of a sudden?
All right. I'll answer
Chris
both.
Wrights in The Secret Sun.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, I will write. Wow. I will write. Jeez. How'd that? I think my head just got co-opted for a second. So to answer your first part, yeah, I absolutely believe that humans experience inspiration. I think speak of Secret Sun, like Liz Fraser of the Cocteau Twins, it seems like she can really let herself empty out and let whatever it is from a higher dimension kind of allow to use her as a portal or a vessel. I mean, things come fully formed when I discovered that there's actually a secret meaning in a certain order of a certain album. It came to me like bam, 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 bam. So these things come in like downloadable chunks, and it's up to us to step up to the plate and be able to met it out in communicatable pieces, of course, which can drive a lot of us, anyways. So I think you had a second part to that I want to address quickly. What were you saying about second part, please?
Are you talking to me about?
Yeah. Say again.
Am I on mute?
No, I can hear you. It's just going a little slow.
No, about 1948. Again, we were sort of putt-putting.
Yep.
Just shot up.
The thing with Jack Parsons in 48, and there's a lot of ways to see this. I still have a favorable opinion of that he did some kind of magic, that did some kind of rift opening, and like David Lynch shows in the famous episode 8 of The Return of Twin Peaks, where he's showing like there's some forces coming through the veil. And of course, Gordon Cole, Lynch's character, the big reveal, of course, is always in front of a mushroom cloud. Yeah. So I think that the technology developed there was related to what he was doing, and maybe something that was playing chess with humans lined up a few things. I don't know. I'm just speculating, right?
No, I think that makes sense. All right. And as we get close to the end, Vanessa, is there any, I always like to ask so people can associate it with modern pop culture, because sometimes it's just an easier way to understand these ancient myths. Any work or fiction or movie do you think that gives justice to the Sumerian mythos?
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, I mean, what The Exorcist 2 or The Exorcist maybe draws from. Oh, that's Pazuzu. I think that's different.
Honestly, I can't think of anything. The few that do deal with it, like the aforementioned Exorcist, tend to get things wrong, and miss the bigger picture. Honestly, it's been kind of a point of frustration for me to even try to relate this stuff, because it's like anytime Hollywood or even big name publishing houses of books tries to tell stories with these sort of pieces, they can't help but color it from the perspective of the empire, from the perspective of, Christianization and this.
How about Norse mythology? How about Norse mythology? Is there any tenuous connection? Eventually it probably traces back, but it kind of has an alien feel to it, like Sumerian.
There's definitely a lot of very interesting parallels between, like, especially, like Hel being related to Ereshkigal, Thor being related to Ninurta. Like, there's definitely a lot of the same archetypes. I don't know for certain that there's a direct historicity there, like a direct, line of influence that we can definitely trace, but there's a lot, like from an archetypal standpoint, there are a lot of very interesting parallels, even down to like the way that the world is constructed. It seems like the Norse mythology kind of has a very similar worldview, but with some with their own unique twist to it and their own extra pieces added, if that makes sense.
Do the
So
Sumerians have an end of the world scenario, or was things just cyclical?
definitely cyclical. I mean, they viewed everything from an astrological perspective, and from astrological perspective, everything is cyclical. So they very much it was a cyclical, but not in the same way that not in the same way as like the Hindu like Kali Yuga periods and all that, but rather more like time just keeps going, but and remixes over time rather than like full on repeats, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
The same story is told 1,000 different ways with like 1,000 different people, but the underlying archetype is the same rather than like history actually physically repeating itself.
Right. Not like Nietzsche and Ouspensky where it just repeats itself. There's,
right,
like you said, it's the same archetypal story, but different expressions or different wrinkles in time.
exactly.
A little bit of a cliche. But all right, well, this really has been wonderful. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on. I hope we have set it straight and really offered the audiences some great gnosis about the Sumerians, how they relate to Gnosticism and all that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
Pleasure's all ours, and we should have you next time about talk about the Kabbalah, because I know you're into that and that. But I was like, that could be a full show. That, yeah. You came ready with the Zohar. I don't have a book, but I do have a copy of the Zohar myself. So
that's actually an abridged version.
yes, it can be. Yes, it's good to have a commentary with the Zohar. But Vance, thanks for handling the questions and coming on with your own great questions.
Oh, my pleasure. It looks like I'm starting to get the hang of it, I think.
There you go, handling the wonderful people in the chat room who keep us great company and give us great questions. And Nate, thanks for coming back and sharing your own gnosis.
Thank you guys so much. It's been great talking with you all. Cheers.
I really enjoyed it. And thank you for the audience for coming here. Again, this will be out audio in a couple of days. Obviously on YouTube, it will be saved so you can listen to the whole enchilada whenever you want. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Please support the show in any way you can. And thanks for being here, and thanks for being yourself, your true self. Good night, everybody, and thank you.